Oma woke up from a terrifying dream, her heart beating through her chest as her entire body shook in terror. Mommy, daddy. She screamed out loud as her parents rushed in to check up on her. She wants to take me away, Oma said persistently as she cried and begged her mother not to leave her alone in her room. Her mother, seeing how terrified her daughter was, decided to sleep over in her room, holding her tight and reassuring her that no one was out to get her. It was just a nightmare, Anne said to her man, who drifted into a deep sleep knowing that her mother was right there with her. When morning came, Ike noticed some scratch marks on her daughter's arm. Why did you scratch yourself? She asked Oma, who told her that it was the woman in her dream come often said as she trimmed Oma's nails and got her ready for school. Later that afternoon, Anne and her husband Hannah decided to attend their midweek service in church. It was such a pleasant time in the presence of the Lord. After the service, they walked towards their car when they caught sight of a pregnant woman who looked so distressed, weeping at the corner of the church alone. Everyone seemed to ignore the woman as though she was invisible, and this troubled her who could not bring herself to ignoring a pregnant woman in distress. She approached her to find out why she was crying, and the woman revealed to her that her husband died in his sleep a few days ago, leaving her all alone in this wicked world. His family, on hearing about his death, threw her out of her husband's house, believing that she had a hand in her husband's death. She told her that she came to the church that evening to pray to God to send the helper her way because she was at the verge of ending it all. Anne could not help but feel compassion for the poor woman. She asked where she lived at the moment, and the woman revealed to her that she was currently staying in an uncompleted building down the road. This was such a devastating story for Anne, who remembered how her own mother suffered a similar fate in the hands of her wicked uncles who took everything from them after her father died. It was such a painful time for Anne, who had to age on the streets for years to support her poor mother, unwilling to see another woman suffer the same fate as her mother. Anne spoke to her husband, who could not help but feel pity for the poor widow. They offered her their boy quarters, promising to take care of all her needs. The woman, whose name was Gika, was so overwhelmed with gratitude and couldn't believe her ears. She thanked them for their kindness as they drove together to their home. A few minutes later, they arrived there home, and the woman could not believe how beautiful their house was. Their little daughter Oma, on hearing their car pull up in the driveway, rushed out to greet her parents. When she was confronted by the sight of the strange woman, she quickly rushed to her mother's side to ask who the strange woman was, and her mother informed her that the woman would be living with them for a while. Oma did not seem too pleased to hear this. She told her mother that she did not like the woman, but her mother laughed it off and advised her to be more receptive of strangers. It then showed Jean to the boy scatters, which had everything that she would ever need. Once she was settled, she returned to the main house and met her daughter Oma, who looked so worried and terrified. This was so weird because Oma was such a cheerful and outgoing girl. Her mother approached her to confirm why she looked so gloomy, and Oma confessed to her mother that she had a terrifying dream about the woman a few days ago. How is that possible when you have never met her before? Her mother asked us. She assured Oma that it was her mind playing tricks on her. Oma pleaded with her mother to send the strange woman away, but her mother reassured her that it was only a dream and that Gina was in need of their help as she had nowhere else to go. She told Oma that Gina was only with them for a while and that she should not worry her little self. Oma was however not convinced as she dreaded the thought of living in the same house. As Gika, she approached her father and made the same complaint to him, but her father was equally dismissive. Attributing her fears to the imagination of a little girl, he assured her that everything would be fine and urged her to give Jima a chance. However, despite her parents' reassurances, Oma was still terrified. She went to sleep that night and heard a weird sound coming from under her bed. Oma checked to see what it was and saw a scary-looking monkey with red eyes. She screamed at the top of her voice, waking her mother and father, who rushed to check up on her. They arrived to her room and met Oma. Terrified, "There's a monkey underneath my bed," Oma said to her parents, who checked at and found nothing under the bed. Her father revealed to her that there was nothing there and that she most likely had a terrifying dream, but Oma insisted that a monkey was under her bed. Her mother, can seeing how petrified she looked, assured her that she was only seeing things and that there was no monkey in her room, but Oma stood her ground, insisting that she saw a monkey underneath her bed. Her mother decided to stay with her until she fell asleep. The next morning, Oma prepared for school. She was leaving the house and caught sight of Jino, who smiled at her and asked how she liked the monkey. This question terrified Ama, who got into the car speedily, her heart racing because she knew that Jino was up to no good. However, she could not understand why her parents were hell-bent on allowing Gika live in their home on their way to school. Oma pleaded with her mother once again to send Jino away, and her mother fled up in anger because she could not understand why her daughter had refused to be accommodating of the poor widow. She told Oma that if she continued to speak ill of Gika without any reason, she would be punished severely, and Oma, feeling so helpless, remained quiet till she got to school. All she could think about was the monkey she saw underneath her bed. Oma dreaded the thought of returning home, as she wished that time would freeze forever so that she would remain in school, because she feared what would happen to her in her own home. Later that evening, HMA came down for dinner and met her mother, who was having a discussion with Jino in their living room. She was so terrified as she barely spoke to her mother and tried to rush up to the dining table, but her mother called her back to greet Jino properly. Oma looked into Jin's eyes and felt a cold shiver run through her spine. She was so terrified that she peed on herself and began to tremble in fear. Her mother, on seeing what had just happened, apologized to Jino and took Oma up to her room to change her soiled clothes. "What has come over you?" yelled at her daughter angrily as she told her to snap out of her irrational behavior and fear. She decided to tell her daughter why Jino was living with them, hoping that this would calm her down and make her more receptive of the poor widow. She even went further to tell her daughter that they met Jinika in church and that there was no way that she could be a threat to anyone. She's just a poor widow who needs our help, Ain said to her daughter Ama, reiterating the need to show her kindness and compassion, especially at this critical time when she just lost her husband. And man nodded in agreement, despite the fact that she was still shaking in fear. A few hours later, after careful deliberation of all that her mother had said, Oma decided to pay Jika a visit at the boys' quarters to upload to her for all she had done. She arrived at the house and saw something that she never imagined possible. Oma caught sight of Jino sleeping with both of her legs hanging up in the air. Jinika did not look pregnant either and was sleeping in such a weird position. Fire gripped Ama, who quietly returned to her room, unable to understand what she had just said. She tried to speak to her mother about it, but her mother warned had to stop peddling lies about Gino. Oma could see how agitated her mother was and returned to her room broken as. She wondered why her mother never believed anything that she said later. That night Hama struggled to fall asleep. She had a feeling that something terrible was going to happen to her, so she approached her parents in their room and pleaded for them to allow her sleep in their bed, but they refused and sent her back to her room. Oma had never been this shaken in her entire life. As she lay in bed, she heard a weird sound, but this time it was accompanied by a music whisper. Her heart pounded as she looked around her room trying to find the source of the whisper. She saw a shadow moving in the corner of her room. Filled with terror, she hid under her blanket, hoping that it would just go away. Suddenly the whisper became louder and Oma felt a cold hand touch her legs. She screamed and ran out of her room, budging into her parents' room. As she screamed out in fear, her parents, now fully awake, asked to know why she was screaming. "There's a shadow in my room, and it's called my name," Oma said as she let out a very loud cry. Her father decided to check the room to see what could have terrified his daughter. He searched thoroughly but found nothing unusual in the room. However, what he noticed was that her window was slightly open. He might have been the wind that you heard, he said to his daughter Oma, who disagreed with him, saying that something was in her room. "Nothing seems to be here," he said to Oma as he tucked her back in bed, assuring her that everything was a fabrication of her imagination. Seeing how she looked, he decided to stay back in her room till she fell asleep, and a few minutes later Oma fell into a very deep sleep, and her father snuck out of her room trying not to wake her up. Immediately he left the room. He heard a weird sound and decided to return back to check what it was. To his utmost surprise, he saw his daughter in the dark sleeping. As she stood at the spot, she seemed to be mumbling some strange words with a strange voice that he had never heard before. Oma seemed to obviously be in a very deep sleep and had no idea what she was doing. Her father knew that something had taken over his daughter's body. He tried to wake her up from the trance, but nothing he did worked, as Ama continued to mumble the strange words, then suddenly stopped and fell to the ground. Unconscious, he yelled out for his wife, who rushed in to meet their daughter lifeless on the ground. "What happened?" I screamed out in fear as she rushed to embrace her daughter's body, trying to wake her up, but Oma seemed so lifeless and cold. "What happened?" she asked again. As her husband narrated all that happened to her. "She is dead," Ain said, her voice filled with regret. "We should have listened to her," her husband replied, as Ain ran quickly to confront Gika in the boys' quarters. By the time they arrived the boys' quarters, it was empty. The room reeked of a terrible smell with blood stains and weird markings that showed that Gino was indeed a witch. What they did not know was that Gino was the one behind all the terrible things that had been happening to their daughter. She planned everything out and pretended to be pregnant to gain a case sympathy in church. She even fabricated a story that sounded more like what Ain and her mother went through in the past to gain her sympathy. This she did because she had tried severally to possess Oma in the dream but couldn't. So she decided to gain their sympathy so as to gain access to their home to make it easy to possess their daughter. "How did we let this happen?" Ain said as they rushed Amama to the hospital. "She is dead," the doctor pronounced as AK quickly put her daughter in the car and headed straight to the church. Halfway through the journey, their car broke down and came to a complete halt. Panicking, he flagged down a taxi who refused to carry them. On sighting the lifeless body of their child, they stood there for some minutes and noticed that no car was Willing to help them, they ran for a few minutes and were surrounded by some armed men who hijacked their daughter from them. At Gunoyi watched in terror as the men queued away with her daughter. She wailed uncontrollably, helpless at the thought of never seeing her daughter again. Her hopes dashed as she watched the men drive off with her precious daughter. What are they going to do with my daughter? She screamed aloud, the pain piercing the deepest part of her heart. It was a nightmare that seemed to have no end. As they wondered why things were suddenly spiraling out of control as they sat in their car confused, the young man approached them saying that he had the power to save their daughter. He told them that time was no longer on their side and that they needed to act fast if they ever wanted to see their daughter again. Desperate for his solution, and her husband Ehane told the man to do everything within his power to save their daughter. They walked to an abandoned house not too far from the road, and the man requested that some money be dropped to appease the spirits. Before he can proceed, Anna dropped a bundle of money in the bowl as the man began his incantations. As they stood there terrified, the whole place began to shake as the witch appeared before them, fuming in anger. "How dare you summon me?" she yelled angrily at the man who tried to strike her with his power but failed. The witch let out a terrifying laughter as she turned the man into a monkey before their eyes and scampered for their dear lives. They had not seen anything like this before. They ran for some minutes and saw a taxi that stopped to give them a ride. "Is everything okay?" the taxi driver asked as he watched them jump into the car, panting and gasping for air. Grateful to the man for stopping to help them, narrated their story to him, and the man informed them of a very powerful woman who had the power to save their daughter. He took them to her, but immediately the woman set her eyes on them, she began to scream